Thank you very much, Bruce. It's very flattering. I appreciate it. And thank you to Lisa and all of the staff at the CLPR for having me here. I'm really excited to be here today and to share a little bit about some of the research that I have recently conducted and share some of the preliminary results at this stage from a short-term study of school reform organization in some of its schools, and I'm looking forward to having an engaging debate or talk with all of you today about these results. So like Bruce said, I'm at the Graduate School of Education, and I teach in three different areas there. I teach in the Policy and Organizations PhD program, and I also prepare future educational leaders in the Principal Leadership Institute, as well as the Leadership for Educational Equity program. It's an EDD program for educational leaders. And before I get too far, I just want to thank a couple of my graduate students who contributed quite a bit to the research that I'm presenting today. Neither can be here today. They both had previous commitments, but both Sarah Wilton and Tanya Jarrell contributed both to the data collection as well as the analysis. So I just want to give them the proper kudos. Thank you to you both. Now, right now, it's a really exciting time in public education. Everywhere I look, people are talking about reform. Right? So President Obama is making headlines with reform right now. Facebook's founder, Mark Zuckerberg, just poured $100 million into a school district in the name of reform. Everyone's talking about how best to go about the school reform issue. Right? Leaders of big city school districts right now, or big cities, are getting involved in running large school systems. So several people have now made education their top priority. So the debate about how best to do this is just becoming richer and richer, with multiple voices sort of entering the arena. And at the same time, what we see policy-wise is we see that from the federal and the state perspective, the feds and the states are really taking a more active role in what's happening inside of our schools, and really at the classroom level, what's happening inside of classrooms, more so than at any other time, perhaps, in our nation's history. So there's a lot blooming right now in public education. And at the same time, for the first time in our nation's history, Latino students are a majority in the state's student population. Right now, we number more than 3.2 million, and the Latino student population, I just read the statistic the other day, and I thought, wow, this is a really powerful way to sort of present the strength of reforms that are targeted towards students of color. So in terms of Latino students, the population of in California, the Latino population, student population, is larger than the individual student populations of every state in the union except Texas. And when you combine Latino students with Asian, African American, Pacific Islander, and mixed race students, these, quote, minority students in California make up 73% of all students. Right? So we're not talking about a small segment of our population when we talk about school reforms that are aimed at students of color. We're talking about an enormous group of students, and this has major implications for the quality of education for our students. So alongside these policy trends and these demographic trends right now, you have, there's an entire school improvement industry right now that's just booming with reform efforts. So this industry, according to Brian Rohn, you can think about this industry as being composed right now of various organizations that exist outside of the traditional public school system. So think about nonprofits, universities, for-profit educational providers, management organizations. Now there's a range of these. Let me just stop and close this. I'm having trouble seeing the side of the room, so I think I'm ignoring you all. What was that? Great, thanks. Okay, now I'll stop ignoring you. Great. So the school improvement industry right now, this whole group of organizations that exist outside of the public school system, right? This exists, and this affects the structure and the function of our public schools, but it doesn't necessarily. But we're not entirely sure how the different ways in which the school reform industry is affecting what happens inside of our schools. Now, one of these types of organizations, a nonprofit school reform organization here in California, was the subject of my study. And let me actually take a step back. I'll talk a little bit more about school reform organizations in general. So some of you may have heard them referred to by other names right now. People in the school reform world are talking about external service providers. They're talking about non-system actors. They're talking about management organizations. And many of these groups are designed to provide schools and districts with information, with training, with materials, or with programs that are intended to achieve a certain instructional goal inside of schools. Sometimes operational goals as well, oftentimes operational goals, but the topic of this talk is we're narrowly focused on the instructional goals. And many of these organizations, they tend to fill sort of a particular niche when they design their services. So some of them market themselves as promoting a particular educational philosophy. Others market themselves as promoting a specific instructional program. And then some market their work as helping to boost the achievement of certain groups of students, right? Whether it be English learners or students of color and so forth. And while we're seeing increasing studies of how these organizations sort of affect oftentimes implementation efforts inside of schools, or sort of what the sort of organizational and technical dynamics are of the relationships with schools or with school districts, we don't necessarily understand yet the degree to which they're actually or their work is actually associated with certain, with different kinds of instruction. So the degree to which scholars have looked at the quality of instruction that's associated with these different reform partnerships, that's still a little unclear. So that's what I set out to do when I looked at the work taking place here in California. Now let me take a step back and share a little bit about the policy context. I think it's a fairly diverse crowd in here, so I'm a little unclear about everyone's different familiarity with the policies. So for some of you, this may be background, some of you, this may be new. At the federal level, our schools have been being governed under the No Child Left Behind Act since 2001. This is the legislation that at its cornerstone included a system of high-stakes testing, meaning that schools are now expected to get all students up to a certain standard of performance on tests, and consequences are linked to these to schools' test performance. At the same time, the No Child Left Behind Act brought in a much sharper focus on subgroup performance. And by subgroups, I'm talking about English learners, talking about low-income students, talking about different racial and linguistic minorities. So now part of the policy discourse is now really about how different groups that have historically been underserved by the public school system, how these groups are doing on these tests. At the same time, this legislation also brought districts into the center of the picture more so than in the past. Districts used to sort of be kind of on the periphery of school reform, and now they're much more in the center of the work, because districts are now also held accountable under this act for how individual schools do. So no longer is the focus just on individual schools as the unit of intervention. It's now on entire school districts. And at the same time, what we see under the No Child Left Behind Act is that there's much more political rhetoric around educational equity and around improving performance for students of color, for English learners, and so forth. Now, at the state level, we have a few different things brewing in our particular state. We have a standards-aligned state assessment. It's called the California Standards Test. And this standards-based test forms the primary basis of our state's annual gauge for student performance, the Academic Performance Index. At the same time, we have a very small number of standards-aligned textbooks and intervention programs that the state has endorsed as state-approved textbooks. And these textbooks and programs are tools of the state to really reinforce the state's standards and to align the work now between the state's curriculum, the state's assessments, and then what's happening inside, what's being taught inside the classrooms. And finally, the sort of last prong of the California instructional policy context is our low-performing school program. So California, for some time, although it's changed, it's actually gone through several iterations. It's offered, it's provided a large-scale low-performing schools program that over time has become a system of fairly hefty grants that have been given to schools and districts in exchange for demonstrated fidelity to the state standards, to state materials, and state programs. So what we see within our state is a policy context that sort of sets the condition for schools and districts to respond to incentives to align their work with a policy system like this. So here's a system that banks on standards and assessments and materials and grants that are all sort of focused on these issues around standards alignment. So at the school and the district level, schools and districts are sort of picking up on that. So what's happening inside of districts? Well, a range of things are happening inside of districts, but one of the major trends right now is that we see an increased emphasis on standards alignment. So everything I just talked about today, aligning what happens inside of the classroom, the content of teachers' instruction with state standards. We also see an increasing emphasis on instructional standardization. So with a policy, with a state policy or accountability context like this, standardizing what's happening across classrooms is seen as sort of the most efficient way to go about increasing in your performance in order to meet the federal policy goals. Also within districts right now, we see more test-based instructional improvement strategies, more test preparation, more focused, more narrowed curriculum that's focusing specifically on tested content. And finally, we see a reliance on school reform organizations that's greater than in years past, where districts are now working more closely with these external support organizations to boost their school performance. So particularly in sort of this resource-scarce environment now where districts are being asked to do more with less, school districts are finding external agencies to sort of help them do some of the things that they don't feel sufficiently capable to do themselves. But there's an assumption in these current instructional policies, and this is the assumption that standards alignment improves equity and improves quality. Right? That's what the political rhetoric is all about right now under the No Child Left Behind Act and even under the Race to the Top initiative. Right? And this assumption can be traced to multiple sort of, areas. A couple places in the literature, though, that we can trace this assumption is to the economic literature on policy instruments. So sort of from an economic point of view, we've seen arguments being made that policy instruments like state goals, incentives, and pressures can change teachers. These instruments can change teachers' motivation to learn, and they can help improve their instruction. Right? That's kind of the economic model. We can also trace it to the literature on systemic reform. So if you look at Smith and O'Day's early work, here we see arguments being made in favor of the systemic coordination of goals, of capacity building resources, and accountability performance, and the assumption that all of these things, that sort of if you tweak all of these different components of the puzzle, that teachers are going to be motivated and then have the capacity to learn and improve their instruction. But this is the assumption that I keep sort of getting stuck on when I look at what's happening in the school reform world. Now, right now, other scholars have studied school reform organizations. It's a somewhat new literature, but we do know at this point some things about it, right? We know that the non-system actors are able to really shape the policy messages that teachers receive about what matters inside of their classroom. We also know that at the district level, school reform organizations can in fact help districts meet accountability goals by translating accountability-specific knowledge for them. Right? We also know that the political relationships between different external support providers or reform organizations, that these political relationships can either dilute or can amplify through how instructional policies play out inside of schools. And we also know that right now there's still this sort of tension that exists between democratic control of schools and market control of schools when you have a school reform organization working with a district or a school. So these are some of the things we've already learned about school reform organizations. What we don't yet fully understand, though, is what types of instruction, like I was saying earlier, what types of instruction do school reform organizations promote? and what types of instruction are they perhaps ignoring or just overlooking in their reform efforts. At the same time, what we don't have a lot of clarity around is the role that the current instructional policies might play in shaping these organizations' willingness to promote different types of instruction. So that's what I set out to investigate in the study that I'm reporting on today. Now I'll go into the specifics about the sample and whatnot, but first I'll share with you the general questions that we're going to set out to answer today. These are two questions among several questions from the study. We're just sort of taking a slice, like I said, of the preliminary analysis of these results. The first question asks, what elements of one school reform organization's theory of action are reflected in its schools? And what does instruction look like in the school reform organization's schools, and why? If anybody wants to come in, you can feel free to walk behind me. There are people back there? Yeah. They're just stacking up. Yeah, I just see a lot of people looking over there. Yeah. I'll just come back over here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the study, just very briefly, before we talk about what it is that I found. Okay, so what I'm reporting on today is a mixed methods case study. It's a comparative case study. So I looked at a range of 6 schools that all partnered with one reform organization. Data collection took place over a little over a semester, just around 6 months. This was a short-term study, and it included over 40 interviews with administrators and teachers inside of the schools, as well as staff at the reform organization. It included almost 300 lesson observation snapshots that were structured using a lesson observation protocol that was designed based on several previously validated studies, or instruments, excuse me. Almost 100 teacher surveys, roughly 40 observational site visits, and multiple documents from both the reform organization itself and its schools. Data analysis included, in addition to the conventional coding of transcripts, as well as the instructional task analyses, instructional sort of field notes that we took when observing classrooms. We also conducted qualitative comparative analysis of our instructional data. Quantitatively, we looked at, or we conducted cross-case descriptive analyses of both our survey data and our classroom observation data. Okay, so what was this reform organization doing? So here's their model. This is a reform organization that said, we exist to close the achievement gap in schools that serve high percentages of English learners, of Latinos and African Americans. We do this by partnering with the school district first and foremost, and then also sort of secondarily with individual schools. And we do this over multiple years, anywhere between 4 and 7 years. And when we go into schools, we do a few things. We try to build their professional learning systems. We try to build their instructional program, among other areas. I'm going to focus today on how the reform organization attempted to build schools' professional learning systems, as well as build schools, or sort of develop the instruction inside of schools. Even though there were other components of its model for today's presentation, that's what we're focusing on, professional learning and instruction. And this is their theory of action. So this is what the organization said. They said, if we provide a rich, culturally relevant, standards-based curriculum to our students in a way that continually takes into account and responds to all of their academic and their affective strengths and needs, their achievement will accelerate, they will achieve standards mastery, and they will be prepared for their futures. So there are a few ways to sort of break down this theory of action, and I've underlined a few of the key terms here. So they talk about it providing a rich curriculum. So we tried to operationalize that when we went into schools. What does that mean to provide sort of a rich learning experience or a rich curriculum for students? A culturally relevant curriculum as well as a standards-based curriculum. And they said if we were doing these things, then we're going to meet all of their academic strengths and needs and their affective strengths and needs. So when we went into our schools to look for evidence of how this reform work was playing out inside of schools, these are sort of some of the issues that we, or areas that we tried to operationalize when we looked in schools. So first, we looked for, so how did we operationalize this? First, we looked for evidence of professional learning about strategies for supporting students of color. We looked for evidence of professional learning that related to strategies for supporting English learners. Professional learning focused on culturally responsive materials and classroom management. Evidence of professional learning related to culturally relevant pedagogy, and professional learning about standards-based instructional tools. So if you go back to their theory of action, this was sort of how we made sense of it after successive interviews with the reform organization staff, where they said, this is really what our model is. This is sort of, when we said, what is it that you're actually doing, this is sort of what repeatedly came up in our interviews with them. In terms of instruction, we then looked for evidence of instruction that included these same things, because if the organization promoting professional learning that focuses on we ought to see evidence of these same things taking place at the classroom level. So we looked for, when we walked into classrooms, we looked for strategies then for supporting students of color, for supporting English learners. We looked for culturally responsive classroom management and materials, culturally relevant pedagogy, as well as standards-based instructional tasks. We also decided to look for other evidence of rich instruction. Now, they talked, if you look back at the theory of action, this organization said, we also just are interested in providing a rich curriculum to our students that takes into account a response to all the other academic and other strengths and needs. We said, okay, an argument could be made that even if we don't see evidence of all of these things that the organization is promoting, says it's promoting inside of schools, the argument could be made that if we still just see a fairly high level of instruction, according to some other indicators, maybe the organization is really doing something quite powerful. So we turned to the literature on effective schools and on school improvement, and we asked, what is it that we should expect to see inside of schools and classrooms in terms of instructional quality? What does the literature say instruction looks like in high-quality schools? Well, we should see cognitively complex instruction. We ought to see differentiated opportunities for students to learn in terms of differentiated materials, in terms of differentiated grouping, or in terms of differentiated curriculum for students. We ought to see a strict focus on learning, and by that what I mean, you sort of hear that jargon a lot actually, and I never know what people mean by that. What we meant by that is that we ought to see students on task and actually engaging in learning. So we ought to see a very low level of non-instructional activity taking place in these schools. We ought to see coherent lessons, and by coherent we meant that we ought to see lessons that have a beginning and a middle and an end. Opportunity for review. There's a point to the learning. There's a clear objective. Students are aware of it, and there's some coherence to the learning. So we also looked for these other indicators of quality instruction beyond what the organization was specifically targeting in its schools. We looked across 6 of its schools that represented sort of a range of growth patterns. So they partnered with the organization, and several of these schools had been highlighted as schools that were really succeeding under this reform model. Not all of them had, but most of them served in different combinations, high percentages of Latinos or African Americans, English learners, and students who qualified for free and reduced price lunch. They also represented a range of reform work, but I'll continue to sort of, as I share the results, I'll continue to display the results in order from school A all the way to school F in the same order. So this is just a snapshot of the schools that we looked at. Okay, so how did the reformers inside of this organization characterize their services? Well, the majority of them actually characterize their services fairly consistently. And this is a quote that's representative of these characterizations. So somebody said, one of the staff members said, the thing that makes us specialized is our interest in equity, to make sure that we're bringing up the kids and the teachers for those kids who are the most challenged. The English learner integration, the work around equity, these are the powerful tools for for any school. So this is how it really, this quote represents what the majority of the staff said about the work that they do in school. And then there was still a dissenting minority inside of the organization, though, and this quote kind of represents that dissension. Somebody had a few of the staff members had concerns about their model. And this one represents this quite nicely, I thought. Someone said, we're an organization that aspires to be something that at this point we're not, which is a culturally reflective and culturally responsive and culturally respectful organization. And we want to set ourselves apart from organizations that provide a kind of colonial approach to supporting schools, but we still need to build our skills to do that. So there was a minority of their staff that didn't think that they were quite there yet with reaching this theory of action. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is I'll share with you some of our results that relate to the professional learning inside of schools. From there, I'm going to share with you some of the results that relate to the actual instruction that we observed, and then I'd like to have a conversation about some of these patterns and considerations about why these patterns were what they were inside of schools. Okay, so if we get back to how we operationalize their theory of action, first we said these are the things we ought to see if we go into classrooms. We ought to see professional development or just opportunities for teachers to engage in professional learning around these 5 things. So when we surveyed teachers about their professional learning experiences, just related to, broadly speaking, best practices for supporting students of color, we asked them whether this topic was a major focus or a minor focus or no focus at all inside of their professional development. And I'd like to call your attention to the red. So if you see here, the red represents the percentage of teachers who said that this topic received a major focus inside of a major focus in their professional learning. It's actually fairly small across most schools, with the exception of School C. School C actually reported, and you'll see this is consistent for School C, reported that this was a fairly major focus for their professional development at their school. When we surveyed teachers about their professional learning experiences that related specifically to English learner instructional strategies, we saw a little more opportunity here for this type of learning. So the schools that show a little more of a major focus, we see a little more here at School D and a little more, but still see quite a bit where this yellow or orange shows either no focus or a minor focus inside of their professional learning. So it's not necessarily a huge focus.
School A and which other one have that large percentage of ELL students?
Yeah. And E. Yeah. So you would think that you might see something more happening there, right? Right. Just checking that. Optimistic. Right, and so here, when we surveyed teachers about the professional learning that they related specifically to culturally responsive classroom management or materials, we saw a similar pattern where not too many teachers reported that this was a major focus, except for School C again. And at several of them, the degree to which this received no focus or minor focus was actually quite large.
So if you were just asking them, is there a major, minor, or no emphasis on culturally responsive materials? You're not specifying some aspect of what that would mean. You're requiring the teachers to interpret that.
In this item that I'm reporting today, that interpretation existed, but in earlier parts of the survey, that was defined for them. And in fact, I didn't go into how we defined that, but if people have questions about those definitions, I can share those with you. When we look for the same thing, professional learning focused on culturally relevant pedagogy, very similar pattern existed. We have this school that sort of stands out, School C, where this was a fairly major focus of their professional development. Beyond that, this was non-existent in one school and quite low in the others. And then just more broadly speaking, we just asked, well, maybe they're just having general conversations about the impact of race and class on instruction. asked them about that, and again, the pattern persisted here too. So School C stands out. And this is a school that was actually the lowest performing school in its district. This was a school that didn't look like our other schools, and that's really a topic for another presentation, but this is a school where the organization also talked about how they didn't know what to do with School C. And they were trying different things with School C. From School C's perspective, the qualitative data show that they actually felt like the organization didn't know what to do with them either, and they sort of felt like the resources weren't helpful to them because they just weren't targeted enough. So even though they were reporting a greater level of focus on these topics, that didn't necessarily resonate with teachers. Okay, but now when we ask teachers to report the degree to which professional learning about standards-based instructional alignment took place inside of their professional development, then now you see a lot more red on the screen. So now you see in most schools, except for School C, this extremely low-performing school, you see that standards-based instructional alignment was a major focus. Over 50% of the teachers in most schools reported that this had received a major focus in their professional development. Right, so this really the efforts slide. Okay, so I'll go on to reflection. Let's see, what's the next slide? Okay. When we looked, so first we looked at the professional learning systems that took place in schools, and then we spent a fair amount of time looking at instruction. So we sent 2 researchers into classrooms, and these researchers engaged in a fair amount of intermediary training prior to going into classrooms to make sure that when they observed evidence, or when they recorded evidence of particular practices inside of the schools, they were seeing the same thing. So after a fair amount of training to make sure that what later A defined as strategies to support students of color, later B also defined as strategies to support students of color, then they were ready to go inside of classrooms. Like I said, so this is based on about 300 snapshots of lessons. And I can talk, if people are interested later, I can talk about how those snapshots were structured and how that's defined. But when we looked at, for these same 5 things, strategies to support students of color, to support English learners, culturally responsive classroom management and materials, culturally relevant and materials, and standards-based instruction. I think I'm missing one on there. And standards-based instruction, what we saw here was something that really shocked us. We saw a remarkably low level of any of these taking place in the classroom. Now, you might think that regardless of what the reform organization was doing, right, some of this could still be taking place in the classroom. Even if the reform work didn't focus on these, this may be a part of teachers' pedagogical repertoire. That wasn't the case in these schools. You can see there are instances where there are several schools where there are no strategies observed for supporting students of color, very low strategies for supporting English learners, except for School E, but that's still, if you look, it's only of the observations. But when you look for evidence of standards-based, that's where our snapshots really shot up. So this is where they just vaulted. And in some schools, it was up to almost 90%, where the majority of the observation snapshots that we took did include evidence of standards-based instruction.
Are these bars supposed to sum to 100?
No.
What's the other stuff on the list?
We're going to get to the time wasted. Okay, but recall that I said in addition to looking for certain opportunities for professional learning and certain types of instruction that reflected the specifics of the organization's theory of action, we were also just interested in these more broad indicators of instructional quality, right? Because like I had said earlier, an argument could be made that even if we didn't see evidence of this, maybe if we saw evidence of all these other indicators of instructional quality, then maybe we might want to reconceptualize what we conceive of as a good school or as a good classroom that serves English learners and students of color. So we looked at these other things that the literature said ought to be present in schools that are testing well, in schools that are engaging in equity-oriented reform work. And this is what we saw. This is a little tricky, so I'm going to talk about this, but then I'm going to go to another slide and then go back. So here we looked at the cognitive complexity of the instruction, and we compared that just to, again, the standards-based instruction that we observed across the schools. Again, the black bar shows the percentage of snapshots. This is the same as the black bar in the last one. The percentage of snapshots that showed evidence of standards-based content. And then we looked at how cognitively demanding the actual instructional tasks were. So a la Bloom's taxonomy, more or less. And what you see here is you see no blue bars, no red bars, and you see one little white or yellow bar here. And these are the most complex levels of instruction. So we saw out of all of the tasks, 1% of them showed, I just happen to remember that that's the number, 1% of all tasks were rated to be at the analysis level of cognitive complexity inside of these schools. The other half took place into the bottom half of this taxonomy of cognitive complexity. So the orange shows the knowledge or the recall level, sort of the lowest level of cognitive complexity. Look at these bars. The purple then shows comprehension, application shows application is here. So really, across all of the instructional tasks, roughly 50% of them were categorized in the bottom half of this taxonomy of cognitive complexity. So we didn't necessarily see this rigor inside of classrooms that we had hoped to see, but again, we did see consistent standards-based content taking place. This is another way to look at it. If you combine the data from all of the schools, and this is graphically what I was just trying to explain from the last one. If you combine all of the data from the schools, what you see is, it's a little cut off, but...
Sorry, I think we had some computer translation issues.
It must have been my computer. At any rate, so what you see here then is what I was showing. That of the snapshots that we observed, roughly a third of them were at the recall level or the knowledge recall level, a third of them were at the comprehension level, and a third of them were at the application level. And almost none of them were at the level. We also wanted to see if we could find evidence of differentiating instruction, right? We could perhaps still see that teachers are differentiating instruction in terms of giving different students different materials based on their academic needs or interests, creating different learning opportunities for them, or creating different learning or grouping for them. But once again, a similar pattern persisted where differentiation was fairly rare across all schools. We didn't observe it all actually at one of the schools. And this again compares it just to the standards-based instruction, just to show you what part of the model was. What were they doing all of this time? Well, this graph shows you that from a somewhat different perspective. And this doesn't necessarily... This is another way of looking at it. So of all the 300 instructional, roughly 300 snapshots of instruction that we looked at, half of those snapshots included non-instructional activity. So that meant that within these classrooms, were expected to be engaging and learning. Teachers were either addressing discipline problems, they were being interrupted by administrators, they were choosing to talk about non-instructional issues with the kids, they were dismissing them early, they were giving them free time, they were drawing, they were allowing them to color. And this is, I forgot to mention, this is elementary, second and fourth grade classrooms. I should have said that at the outset. So an incredible amount of non-instructional activity was observed in these classrooms. But these are classrooms that are still going up on California standards-based tests, and they're still considered a success sort of in the eyes of the state and in the eyes of the reform organization. Not all of them, but several of them. And getting back to this issue of coherence, sort of how coherent did instruction look when teachers actually began a lesson that had a clear beginning and a clear objective that was clear to the students. It had the successive stages of a lesson that pedagogically you would expect to see, and it had a clear opportunity for review and closure for students. Here what we saw was a fairly high degree of fragmentation in the instruction, and by that I mean we defined fragmentation as teachers teaching discrete tasks that weren't necessarily embedded in something broader, in a broader learning experience. So students were being asked to, for example, engage in memorization activities or in copying activities or in various other skill-building activities, perhaps something more challenging than that. But they weren't necessarily connected to broader learning goals for the students. So they were fairly disconnected learning experiences. I'm going to stop there for a second. So when we looked then for evidence of professional learning opportunities, that's what we saw. When we looked for evidence of certain types of instruction, that's what we saw. Well, some could argue that what we don't necessarily see in all these pretty bars up here, though, is sort of when some of these practices coexisted with one another. So some of them still happened at the same time, and it might be productive, and it's productive then to ask, or it's a constructive question to ask would be, when did some of these practices take place at the same time? So when there was standards-based instruction, what else was happening? Did you see it oftentimes coexisting with culturally relevant pedagogy? Or did you see it coexisting with those few instances of English learners? Well, there's a technique called qualitative comparative analysis, and it allows you to look for these sort of combinations of when these different practices take place, or when these different instances occur in the qualitative data. One thing that we did is we drafted instructional task analyses of all of the lessons that we observed. And then we coded them for instances of all of the concepts discussed today as well as other concepts. And we're just beginning to sort of engage in that analysis. It's fairly preliminary at this point, but I'll show you sort of one table that gives you kind of a flavor of where this analysis is going. This is something called a truth table. It probably doesn't make much sense without walking through it together. So what this shows you is it shows you the occurrence of standards-based instructional tasks with other forms of just quality instruction. So this shows every time in our qualitative data on the lessons, so in the write-ups of the instructional tasks, every time we observed an instance of standards-based instruction. It then shows when it occurred along with these other instances that we were interested in. Now, in the broader database, we actually have more. This sort of, again, just shows you sort of where we're going with the analysis. And then it shows you how often. Without students necessarily being on task, without lessons being coherent, without cultural relevance in the curriculum, and without English learner-specific instruction. In isolation of all of these. with students being on task. So, and we then saw English learner specific. You can sort of take your time to peruse the table. The top line here, where in all of our in isolation of all these other forms of instructional quality that we were interested in. So when the instructional tasks across all of our studies, and the instructional tasks observed throughout the entire study, did we observe standards-based instruction taking place at the same time that students were on task, that the lesson was coherent, that they were engaging in culturally relevant learning, and that the teacher was using English learner-specific instruction. And that's a really low number. Right.
Another way to see the glass is half full instead of or three-quarters full instead of one-quarter empty is to say in 75% of the cases, something other than
That's true. that's true, yes. Right. Now, again, this is not to, and I don't share this data in such a dramatic form to say that what we don't want, to imply that what we don't want is standards-based instruction. California has a fairly rigorous set of curriculum standards, and I don't think that the conclusion to draw from this preliminary analysis is that what we don't want to see is more standards-based instruction. It has its rightful place in schools, and it's an important equity-oriented sort of instructional goal in and of itself. It's the way I see it more is it's necessary, but it's insufficient in terms of the sort of instructional goals that we have for English learners and students of color. This, again, because this is sort of preliminary data, this sort of shows you the direction we're headed with the study. So how do we explain this discrepancy here between what the reform organization espouses to do in its schools and what we actually see happening inside of their classrooms? We also have a fairly rich set of qualitative data right now, and in that data we've interviewed multiple teachers and staff about the forces that are sort of acting on their work, sort of what pressures they experience when they're deciding what they should do inside of their schools and classrooms. And several references are made to the standards and to the California standards test and so forth. That wasn't necessarily a part of the talk today. That's part of the data set that we're writing up. So we sort of consider what I shared today and for that the aspects of the qualitative data. I think there are sort of two considerations at this point. One is that these instructional policies that we discussed at the outset of the presentation, the federal level instructional policies, the state level policies, and these district level sort of policy developments, these instructional policies really narrow the focus on measurable outcomes, right? Test-based outcomes. And these could be inducing districts right now to seek support providers that most efficiently boost test scores through, for example, standards alignment. The other consideration right now is that these instructional policies may also induce school reform organizations to market their services in ways that are consistent with the current political rhetoric about equity. Right? All of the rhetoric right now that we hear under the No Child Left Behind Act, under the Race to the Top initiative, it's about educational equity. Let's see, let me start this one over. So instructional policies may induce school reform organizations to market their services in ways that are consistent with current political rhetoric about equity, but that in practice are not responsive to English learners and students of color. Okay. So here's some final thoughts for us to discuss today. So how can these instructional qualities be crafted differently? How can we craft policies that induce reformers to provide the types of services that are responsive to the instructional needs of English learners, of Latinos and African Americans? And how can we craft instructional policies that are going to privilege more than just content, right? Because what we really saw was a proliferation of a certain type of content, but we didn't necessarily see strong patterns and strong pedagogical patterns. So how can we craft policies that privilege changes in pedagogy, not just content? Okay, and that's it.
Do you want to run your own Q&A, or do you want me to run it?
Let's go ahead and start, and then if I get confused, jump in.
We have question? Lisa? So maybe a simple answer.
Of the puzzle.
So if you look at how they spend, how the reform organizations spend their time in schools, was it around these small meetings and organizing and protocols for...
The organization focused fairly heavily at the leadership level. So at the principal level, at the leadership team level, and occasionally with individual classroom teachers. But the focus, or sort of their unit of intervention was really school leaders. And they made the argument that not so much. Some of it took place, but we didn't see that much. Yeah. Let's see.
So, I went tutoring at high school. It's a charter high school. And I've been working with the ESL community, and I have been doing it for roughly 5 years now. And I very much believe, and one of the things that I was able to see the higher people who, and also teachers, don't necessarily understand cultural backgrounds, language needs. They don't even speak any of the languages that the schools then. They make these policies. They create this specific lesson planning that do not target, and I believe this is what you were talking about. No, they don't know, they don't understand, they don't know how to tackle, and it's very difficult to teach an English learner, for example, how to study if they don't know how to teach them, if they don't understand their language, and if they don't understand their culture, most important. And I continue to see part of how teachers structure. In fact, the school that I was working at full-time, I no longer work, I just go for community service, and they have not gotten a person an ESL instructor with knowledge, that understands, and as a consequence, they're falling behind.
Right. So there's a general competence issue, cultural competence issue. And I hear that when I talk with people at the schools.
Did the reform organization advocate for a particular publishing house or particular set of
They advocated for the textbooks and the publishers that the district had adopted. So that the district was using, they aligned their services with that. So if the district used Houghton Mifflin as the curriculum, then they developed sort of standards-based pacing guides and matrices and whatnot to support that, and then they would change that based on the district.
And I asked that was because math, which I'm not familiar with, there are textbook series that claim at least to achieve astounding results in terms of meeting standards and so forth. And it would seem like there would be a natural tendency for some of these organizations to sort of, again, to the math, affiliate with text series that sort of share their philosophy. So
Well, I think we see some of that in reform organizations that are going out and promoting one specific instruction program, right? Part of their model, and sort of the logic behind their model, is that they go in and attempt to be responsive to the local needs. And rather than go in and advocate for a particular specific program, they make the argument that they're going to be more specialized and more responsive if they don't do that. And we actually see inside of their schools. Morton was next, I think.
Tina, another hypothesis about what's going on. Can you shift back to the slide with all the X's? I mean, the hypothesis is just that teachers can't do this. Teaching culturally relevant material is difficult. There's lots and lots of discussions about its importance. You got the teachers to accept that it's important. They may not accept that it's important. There may be a lot of resistance to doing it. You're talking about getting a lot of teachers who don't speak Spanish to develop EL-specific strategies. Have you told us how long they worked with these teachers? Was it 5 years?
It was a range. So, and they worked with them. The partnerships lasted anywhere from 4 to 7 years.
Okay. So they might have been working with them over years and years.
I think that, across all of their schools. In these schools, I think the top schools were 4 or 5 years, right?
Again, there's this issue, what it takes to get a teacher to be able to teach in culturally relevant ways. And it may take much more time, effort, coherence, cooperation.
Well, and patience on the part of policymakers, right? Because you have this tension then between what's going to be more time-intensive to invest in building the teacher's capacity and what's going to be the most efficient route to this quick boost in performance, right? And from the district administrator's point of view, when the district is now sort of, in the spotlight and under more pressure than in the past to show the sort of quick test gains, what you're talking about is not necessarily what a district administrator wants to see, right? It's costly. And it also then comes along with it. It's a whole other set of challenges when you have teacher turnover and you're continually investing in teachers who are leaving within 2 or 3 years. You have other staffing challenges. You have leadership turnover and whatnot, right? So, but that's absolutely right. That's a good point. Next? Maybe I do need your help, Lisa.
Which I can't see behind me. So, I'm excited that it's been.
Well, I think Lauren's point is well taken. The length of time. I'm curious also about the intensity. I guess maybe you can talk to that, because recently I conducted a very small study that was a little bit similar, but it was focused on the ELL population, and it was looking at the professional development group. The reform group was professional developers. It was a much shorter period of time, it was 2 years, and so I think that document that is not kind of change that you would want to see. But I think also one of the things that I saw was that across the professional developers, although they were part of the same organization, there wasn't really consensus on a pedagogical philosophy.
Right.
And there was really contradiction, actually, because if you look at each of these issues in your column, it seems like there should be some kind of complement between them, but I would argue that there's actually, these are competing goals. And so therefore, once you show up at a school, what you need is for the reform to be coherent, not just the classroom practice to be coherent. And so there's a lot of contradiction about the goals and the emphasis. When teachers are going to be confused, and they bring their own philosophy and their own approach and their own ideas. So I'm just curious, about, you're sort of accepting their theory of action, but I'm curious, like, ultimately, I guess I would argue you need to have a you need to have a foundation of what the theory of action is, and for the specific target group. And maybe it's a different theory of action for ELL than it is for African American, and I think that may be part of what of what you're seeing.
And in the broader study, that is an element of the inquiry. And when we talk with staff, like I said, the majority of the staff sort of characterize their model similarly. But when we try to dig a little deeper and say, what does that actually mean to you when you're promoting an English learner or ELD strategies? What does that look like? And when you promote culturally relevant pedagogy, define that. What do you expect to actually see inside of the classrooms? What are you promoting when you're working with educators? And that varied quite a bit. That's where we saw variation. That was one thing. And it wasn't so much that there was disagreement as much as there was a lack of clarity around it. So that sort of level of specificity. And there was an expectation, we observed this, and there was an expectation, I'll take a step back. There's a dynamic that one of the students on the study actually characterized as the proximity to the classroom, and she said what we don't see is a close enough proximity to the classroom with the types of strategies that they're engaging in. So when we poured through our transcripts, what we saw is quite a bit of conversation about, like I said, working with school leaders, and there was an expectation about the steps that would transpire after that work with school leaders. And if you're working with a school principal to develop their instructional leadership and their instructional sort of conceptions of cultural relevance, for example, there are quite a few assumptions about all the steps that need to take place afterwards to then reach inside of the classroom, to actually impact what's happening inside of the classroom, and we didn't necessarily see that. So I would argue that yes, I think that there are, at least according to these data, there are these technical challenges, right? There are these knowledge challenges, there are these organizational challenges, there are these sort of these variations in everyone's, the staff and educators' conceptions of instructional quality. But there are also political and policy forces that are acting upon this reform organization, right? This reform organization has to renew its contract each year with a school district. And your contract is not going to be renewed if you don't demonstrate that something has changed inside of classrooms. So like somebody pointed out, that takes time. And if you need to renew each year, what is going to show growth? What is the most efficient route to growth? So I think you have this policy pressure, this very sort of subtle policy pressure. Nobody's necessarily talking about it when they explain what it is that they do inside of school. But making that choice necessarily results in a much more intensive, expensive model that you're bringing into work with schools.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, first of all, based on what we rarely policy that's made based on nowadays a lot of times we have policies that are made on the top level, and the teachers, for one hand, they're confused. There's a lot of misunderstanding. There's no time for professional development. There's no commitment to that. And also there's a stagnation of teachers not following me. A lot of teachers are doing this because they have to. And it takes a lot of time, all this testing, all this, going around to get in time. It really drains energy from teachers. And policymakers are not in the classroom to put themselves in the shoes, doable or not, and of course to see the results and doable. Maybe they get the numbers up in terms of funding, but then, they get the feeling that, they're missing on a lot of really, really useful things.
Yeah. From an instructional point of view, you get that feeling, right? Now, when I actually shared these results with the staff at the Reform Organization, they didn't necessarily share this perspective, though, that something was missing. They actually looked at these results, and they saw these results, not this table, but many of the other tables, and a lengthy report with quite a bit of interview data. And they were quite enthusiastic about it, because they said, it's working, we're doing it. What we're trying to do is working. And they were able to disconnect the rhetoric about equity with what they're actually doing inside of schools. And you said that they're sort of this business model. Right? Well, this is an organization that is also pretty heavily infused with consultants from some of the country's most prominent consulting firms. And they didn't view this negatively. They viewed this as an example of their success. So when you say something's missing, I don't think not all reformers say something's missing in that model, right? I think two in the back with a couple more.
At what cost? And I can totally understand. And the problem is that I see over and over again, at least in these two schools I've been going to, is that there's so many burnout of teachers. Why? They're burnt out. To their knowledge is working, but at what cost? And the problem is that the students actually suffer the most because they don't get what they need in order to succeed later on. One. Two, teachers can't be committed to something that is overwhelmingly burning. One. Two, another thing that I see, and I don't know if you looked at this, is the fact that I also interpret IEP readings, and what I keep seeing over and over and over again is the fact that students, English learners, are mostly being tested for learning disabilities and are given medication, and over this is happening, and no one is addressing the fact that it's not a learning disability. So they're giving them all this medication and it's done. Typically is what they're doing. And they're not really looking at the background, the situation that is happening at home and outside the school that contributes to these behavioral issues that you very well addressed. The wasted time in the classroom, which it really is a lot. So it's very alarming. It's very scary to see how many students are being, put in the spot of learning disability, let's give you some medication to deal with it. Not really addressing their behavior.
Right, it works, but at what cost, right? I think we have time for one more.
So one explains the way the organization works with the schools is with the leadership. So then, first of all, with regard to your presentation, again, I would love to hear more about that. What take us down into what those meetings look like, what the presentations are, what the organization, how they think they're teaching about each of these content. So that's one point. And second, I agree with the point you made in response to this lady, which is I can see how someone looks at this and says, well, yeah, this is working. Like ultimately our goal is being met. And so the test scores are rising in most of the schools, right?
Right. At varying levels. At varying levels, but right.
I can see. I agree.
Yeah, and in the write-up, there's a much greater focus on the specific strategies that they're using inside of schools. We're working on that.
In the beginning, you said the school reform industry is just booming, which seems to be true. Why are so many people turning to the school reform organization? Especially when you find out, not just from this, but IIUST and high priority school training programs and so forth, that many of them are Charlotte. So what is it, is this desperation and stampede towards any ray of light or something?
I'd say there are at least a couple of explanations for it. One, right now the policy structure sets up incentives for that. So schools don't see ways to build their own capacity right now when they look at their district office or when they look inside of their schools. Districts at the same time don't see ways to build their own capacity or to reach so many schools at once. Under this policy structure, right, where we have such demanding performance goals for our schools and then for our districts. So if we're being held accountable to such demanding test performance goals, sort of what's the phrase? The shortcut, essentially, forgetting the language, essentially the shortcut to meeting those goals is to try to find somebody else to help you do it, right? You don't, and in doing that, then that means that the district no longer has to fundamentally alter the structure of the district. The school no longer has to fundamentally alter the way the school works. If you're asking somebody from outside to work with you now, that means that sort of pressure is kind of off of you right now, and you can rely on outside expertise to sort of help you sort of tweak around the periphery of your district or your school. But you don't necessarily have to take on the more ambitious improvement work that would require much deeper changes in the structure and the function of your district or your school. So I'd say that's one. The other level, and again this gets back to the policy environment, is there are other incentives, there are funding incentives for this. I mean, if you look at California, we have a very intensive grants program that's, like I said, gone through so many permutations, but like you referred to, at one point there were grants, it was written into our education code where our schools received these hefty grants, and then they were expected to find an external support provider to help them improve their test performance. So it's also innate in the policy itself.
So with that, I'd like to thank Nina for a wonderful